Fire entered her life, the night she agreed to sell what she had sworn to guard. Amaka stood before the landlord, who shouted, "Bring my money by tomorrow, or leave my house." And she answered, "Sir, my examinations are next week. Give me time." He laughed and said, "Time does not pay rent," and pushed her books into the mud. She gathered them with trembling hands, while her neighbors watched from their doors, without speaking. She looked at them and asked, "Are we not one community?" But nobody replied. That same night she heard a crash near the roadside and saw a black car twisted against a tree. A man crawled out bleeding, whispering, "Help me, please," while people gathered and said, "Police trouble is near. Let us go." Amaka stepped forward and said, "If he dies here, we all share the blame." But they shook their heads and dispersed. She tore her wrapper to bind his wound and dragged him toward the clinic with strength she did not know she possessed. At the small private clinic, the nurse said, "Deposit first, treatment later." And Amaka answered, "He will die before morning." The nurse folded her arms and said, "This is not a charity house," and pointed at the door. The injured man tried to speak, but lost consciousness on the bench. Amaka felt anger rise in her chest and said, "Is money now greater than life?" She searched his pockets and found no wallet, no phone, no name, only a card with foreign letters she could not understand. The nurse repeated, "Bring 50,000 naira or take him away," and turned her back. Amaka called her classmates and said, "A man is dying here." But they replied, "We cannot involve ourselves in such matters." She stood alone between the dying stranger and the closed clinic door. Then the nurse lowered her voice and said, "There is another way if you truly want to save him." Amaka looked at her and asked, "What way?" The nurse said, "My cousin will pay the deposit tonight, but he does not give money for free." The meaning of her words fell heavy between them, and Amaka's breath became short. Amaka walked outside and called her only friend Kioma, saying, "They ask for my body in exchange for his life." Kioma shouted, "Are you mad? Leave that man to his fate." Amaka replied, "If I walk away, I become like those who watched my books fall into the mud." She ended the call and returned inside with decision burning in her eyes. She faced the nurse and said, "Call your cousin," while her voice shook but did not break. The nurse studied her and asked, "You are sure?" And Amaka answered, "Life must not be traded cheaply in our land." The cousin arrived, counted the money before her, and said, "You understand the agreement?" Amaka nodded, and the clinic doors finally opened for the stranger. Before dawn, the man was in surgery, and the doctor said, "Another hour, and he would have died." Amaka sat outside alone and whispered, "Let this sacrifice not be wasted." When the procedure ended, the nurse said, "He will live, but you must fulfill your part." Amaka closed her eyes and walked toward the room prepared for her, knowing that by sunrise her life would never return to what it was. As the first light came, she stepped out, changed, silent, and resolute, while the stranger slept without knowledge of the price paid for his breath. She looked at the clinic walls and said to herself, "If one life is saved, the community gains strength." Yet a question struck her heart like a hammer. When the community refuses to stand for one of its own, who carries the burden of righteousness alone? Part 2. The man who did not know. Morning struck her like a slap when she returned to her room and saw her landlord waiting. He said, "Where is my money?" And she answered, "By evening, I will bring it." He laughed and said, "You students speak like politicians," and threatened to throw her things outside. She held his gaze and replied, "Give me this day, and you will not regret it." He walked away, warning, "This is your last sunrise in my house." At the clinic, the stranger opened his eyes and asked, "Where am I?" The doctor replied, "You survived an accident because this young woman refused to abandon you." The man turned to Amaka and said, "What is your name?" She answered, "Amaka," and folded her hands tightly to hide their shaking. He tried to sit up and groaned, saying, "My phone, my driver, where are they?" The nurse said, "There was no driver, and your belongings were not found." He frowned and said, "That is impossible." But the pain forced him back onto the pillow. Amaka watched him and felt both anger and relief. Anger for the cost she paid, relief that he breathed. He said to her, "You saved me." And she answered, "I did what any human should do." He searched her face and asked, "How can I repay you?" She looked away and said, "Recover first." The doctor interrupted, saying, "The hospital bill must still be settled." The man touched his bandaged head and said, "Call my company. They will transfer whatever you need." The nurse replied, "We found no phone or identification." His voice hardened and he said, "My name is Tundadaba." Amaka did not react, for the name meant nothing to her. He asked for a newspaper, and when it arrived he stared at the front page in shock. The headline read that the chief executive of a multinational energy corporation had disappeared after a reported attack on his convoy. He whispered, "They said I was missing." Amaka leaned forward and asked, "Is that you?" He nodded slowly and said, "I am the man they search for." The nurse gasped and said, "Billionaire." He closed his eyes and replied, "Yes." Silence entered the room like a witness demanding testimony. Amaka felt her stomach twist and said, "So you have wealth beyond counting." He answered, "Wealth does not prevent blood from flowing." She asked, "Will your wealth also remember the hands that stopped that blood?" He looked at her carefully and said, "It will." He demanded a phone and called his security chief, saying, "I am alive." Within 1 hour, armed guards filled the clinic compound. The landlord arrived at the same moment to chase Amaka from his property, but he froze when he saw the convoy. Tund stepped out with support and said, "This woman saved my life." The landlord quickly changed his tone and said, "She is a good tenant." Amaka faced him and replied, "Yesterday you called me a burden?" Tund asked, "Is this true?" And the landlord stammered without answer. Tund turned to his assistant and said, "Pay this clinic in full and compensate them." The nurse bowed repeatedly and whispered apologies. Amaka stood still and said, "Money cannot erase what has happened." Tunda studied her and asked, "What has happened?" She hesitated, then said, "The price of your life was demanded before treatment." His eyes narrowed, and he asked, "What price?" The nurse tried to interrupt, but Amaka continued, 50,000 naira and more. The room grew tight with tension. Tund looked at the nurse and said, "Explain yourself." She trembled and said, "We only sought deposit, nothing else." Amaka's voice rose as she said, "Do not lie." Tund signaled his guards and said, "Investigate this matter fully." The nurse fell to her knees, crying, "Forgive me." Tund's face became cold, and he said, "You traded dignity for profit." Amaka stepped forward and said, "Let justice not become revenge." He turned to her and asked, "After what they did to you, you defend them?" She answered, "If we destroy one another, who remains to build?" He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. He said quietly, "You speak like someone older than your years." She replied, "Hardship teaches quickly." Tund ordered his team to settle her rent for 5 years and sponsor her education abroad. The landlord clapped his hands in excitement, but Amaka raised her voice and said, "Stop!" Everyone turned toward her in surprise. She said to Tund, "If you give me riches alone, you solve nothing." He asked, "What do you want?" She answered, "Look at this street. Look at this clinic. People suffer because no one stands for another." He listened without interruption. She continued, "Build a community fund here, a place where no one is refused treatment for lack of money." The crowd outside murmured in approval. Tund asked, "And you?" She replied, "Let me earn my place like every other student." He took a long breath and said, "You saved my life without knowing who I was." She answered, "I did not save a billionaire. I saved a human being." He extended his hand and said, "Then let us rebuild this place together." She looked at his hand, but did not yet take it. As the crowd waited for her answer, Amaka felt the weight of her sacrifice pressing against her future. If she joined him, she might gain power to protect many, but she might also lose the simple identity she fought to keep. She asked herself in silence, can one person change a broken community without becoming part of the system that broke it? The street gathered before noon, and arguments began before greetings were exchanged. An old woman shouted, "Collect his money and travel abroad," while a young man replied, "Let her use him to change this place." The landlord pushed forward and said, "Opportunity knocks once. Foolishness knocks forever." Amaka stood at the center and said, "Do not fight over my life as if it is meat in the market." Tund raised his hand for silence and said, I owe her more than gratitude. A trader answered, Then prove it with action, not promises. Another man muttered, Rich men speak sweetly until cameras leave. Tun's security guards shifted, but he ordered them to stand down. Amaka faced the crowd and said, When that man lay bleeding, none of you stepped forward. A woman responded, We feared police trouble. Amaka replied, Fear cannot build a community. Her words struck them harder than insult. Tund spoke calmly and said, I propose a medical trust for this district. The landlord quickly added, And scholarships for our children. A mechanic shouted, And loans for small businesses. Voices rose until they became a storm of demands. Amaka turned to Tund and asked, If you give without structure, will it not become another failed promise? He answered, Then help me design it. She crossed her arms and said, Will you still listen when my voice opposes yours? He met her eyes and said, Yes. Kioma pushed through the crowd and whispered, Do not trust him fully. Amaka answered, Trust is not blindness. Kioma said, Power changes men. Amaka replied, Then we must build systems that restrain power. Tund called his legal advisor and said, Draft a community foundation controlled by local representatives. The advisor hesitated and asked, Including her? Tund answered firmly, Especially her. Murmurs spread like fire. The landlord protested, She is only a student. Amaka turned sharply and said, Leadership is not rented by age. The old woman nodded and said, Let the girls speak. For the first time, the street listened instead of shouted. Amaka declared, 5 elected members will oversee the fund. A man asked, Who chooses them? She responded, The community votes openly. Tund added, My company will match every naira raised locally. Some clapped, others doubted. A youth leader stepped forward and said, What if corruption enters again? Tund answered, Then audits will expose it. Amaka added, Transparency must be public, not hidden in offices. The people began to see shape where there was once noise. Suddenly, a black SUV arrived carrying men in expensive suits. One of them said, Mr. Adebayo, your board demands immediate return. Tund replied, I will return when I finish here. The man insisted, Shareholders are nervous. Amaka watched the exchange and asked quietly, Will your board support this fund? Tund answered, They will, if I command it. The suited man shook his head and said, Charity weakens investor confidence. The crowd hissed in anger. Amaka stepped forward and said, If profit fears compassion, then profit is fragile. The suited man laughed and replied, Young lady, business is not emotion. She answered, Business that ignores community will one day face its anger. Tension thickened. Tund dismissed the executives and turned back to the people. He said, My position may suffer because of this decision. Amaka asked, Are you ready for that cost? He replied, You paid a greater one for me. Silence followed. A young boy approached Amaka and said, My sister died because we had no money for treatment. His mother stood behind him with tears and said, If this fund begins, others may live. The words cut through doubt like a blade. The landlord, fearing loss of influence, whispered to several men, If she leads this, we lose control. Soon, rumors spread that Amaka sought personal gain. Kioma confronted her and said, They say you want fame. Amaka answered, Let them say. Databanin posters appeared accusing her of manipulating the billionaire. She tore one down and said, Truth does not shout. It stands. Tund saw the hostility and asked, Do you wish to withdraw? She replied, If I withdraw, they win. The next day, a community vote was organized in the open square. Names were written on cardboard, and hands were raised publicly. Some feared retaliation, but Amaka insisted, Courage must begin somewhere. The counting lasted until sunset. When results were announced, Amaka was chosen as chairperson of the foundation. The landlord was not selected, and his face hardened with resentment. Tund congratulated her and said, Now the real work begins. She nodded, understanding that victory carried new enemies. As night approached, the landlord met secretly with a local politician and said, This girl threatens our arrangements. The politician replied, Funds attract power. Power attracts conflict. They agreed to challenge the foundation's legality. Unaware of the plot forming, Amaka addressed the community and said, "Today we prove that unity is possible." Tund added, "Tomorrow we begin construction of the clinic extension." Applause filled the air, but beneath it lay tension. Later, Kioma asked Amaka, "Are you afraid?" She answered honestly, "Yes." Kioma pressed, "Then why continue?" Amaka replied, "Because if we retreat at the first sign of opposition, we deserve the suffering we complain about." That night, Tund received a message from his board threatening removal if he diverted corporate funds. He stared at the screen and whispered, "Must compassion always fight profit?" Meanwhile, the landlord prepared documents to file an injunction against the foundation. Amaka sat alone reviewing plans when her phone vibrated with an anonymous warning. "Step down or be exposed." She clenched her jaw and said, "Expose what?" "No answer. Game." She looked at the signed agreement, establishing the fund, and realized enemies now moved in shadows. If her past sacrifice became public, her dignity would again be tested before the same crowd she tried to uplift. She asked herself, in firm resolve, when truth becomes a weapon in the hands of the bitter, will the community defend its own, or abandon her once more? The morning after the announcement, the street divided into camps. Some people stood before Amaka's room and said, "Lead us, and we will follow," while others whispered, "She has tasted wealth and now wants power." Amaka stepped outside and said, "If you doubt me, question me openly." A man replied, "Then tell us what you truly want from the billionaire." She answered, "I want a structure that will outlive both of us." The landlord laughed from his balcony and said, "Structure begins with money in your pocket." Amaka looked up and replied, "No, it begins with trust in our hands." Murmurs rose again as suspicion and hope wrestled for control. Tund arrived without convoy and called a meeting in the open compound. He said, "My company will release seed capital, but this fund must belong to you." A woman asked, "What if you change your mind tomorrow?" He responded, "Then the legal agreement will bind me." A youth named Sola stepped forward and said, "We have heard promises before." Tund nodded and said, "Then write the terms yourselves." Amaka added, 5 trustees, elected by public vote, with published accounts every quarter. The people exchanged looks as the idea took root. The landlord interrupted, saying, "Elections create enemies." Amaka replied, "Silence creates oppression." An elderly tailor raised his voice and said, "Let the girl speak. She fought when we did not." Shame passed through the crowd like heat. Tund announced, "Voting will happen today." His lawyer hesitated and whispered, "This is irregular." Tunde answered, "So was the night she saved me." The lawyer stepped back, understanding that resistance would not prevail. Names were suggested, some honest, some strategic. The landlord proposed himself and smiled broadly. Amaka said nothing, only wrote each name on cardboard for all to see. She insisted, "No secret ballots. Raise your hands and own your choice." When the vote began, tension tightened every face. Hands rose slowly, some trembling under the weight of social pressure. The landlord counted on his influence, but fewer hands lifted for him than he expected. When Amaka's name was called, more than half the street raised their arms. The result angered those who preferred quiet control. The landlord shouted, "She manipulates sympathy." Amaka responded, "If sacrifice is manipulation, then let us all sacrifice." Tund stepped forward and declared, "The vote stands." Construction plans were displayed the next day. A small extension to the clinic would include emergency beds and a fund desk. A trader asked, "Who will manage the money daily?" Amaka answered, "A trained accountant from within our community." Sola volunteered, saying, "I studied accounting but never found work." Amaka looked at Tund and said, "Opportunity must begin here." Tund nodded and said, "He will receive training from my firm." Applause followed, mixed with disbelief, but resistance did not sleep. That evening, the landlord met with a local politician and said, "This foundation will reduce our leverage." The politician replied, "Funds attract audits. Audits expose secrets." They agreed to challenge the legality of the trust. The next morning, officials arrived with documents claiming the foundation lacked proper permits. Tund examined the papers and said, This is intimidation. Amaka addressed the officials calmly and said, "We welcome inspection." Her steadiness unsettled them. One official whispered, "Withdraw quietly and avoid trouble." She answered, "Trouble already lives here. We are confronting it." The crowd gathered behind her, and for once, no one stepped back. The officials left promising further review. Kyoma pulled Amaka aside and said, "You are making enemies." Amaka replied, "Leadership is not a festival." Kyoma asked, "What if they attack your reputation?" Amaka paused, but said, "Truth must defend me." That afternoon, rumors spread that Amaka had accepted a secret payment from Tund. A printed leaflet accused her of immoral conduct. She read it without blinking and said, "This is their weapon." Tund looked furious and said, "I will sue them." Amaka stopped him and said, "Court battles will divide us further." He asked, "Then what do you propose?" She answered, "Public truth." She called for a meeting at sunset. When the crowd assembled, she held up the leaflet and said, "They threaten exposure." Gasps rippled through the people. She continued, "Yes, I paid a personal price to save his life." Silence fell heavy and complete. The landlord smirked and said, "You see, she is not pure." Amaka faced him and replied, "Purity did not drag a bleeding man to safety." An old woman shouted, "She did what none of us did." Slowly, nods replaced whispers. Tund stepped forward and said, "Whatever she gave, I did not know." He bowed his head and added, "I owe her more than money." The community listened not to scandal but to courage. A man asked, "Why did you not tell us earlier?" Amaka answered, "Because the act was not for applause." She looked around and said, "If my sacrifice disqualifies me, say so now." No one spoke. The youth Sola said, "We judge by action, not gossip." Others echoed agreement. The landlord realized the tide had turned and retreated in anger. Unity began to replace suspicion. Tund addressed them firmly. "This foundation will proceed." He added, "And anyone who spreads lies to weaken it will answer legally." The crowd stood behind Amaka, not out of pity, but respect. When the meeting ended, Kyoma whispered, "You risked everything." Amaka replied, "Community demands honesty." She felt both exposed and strengthened at once. Later that night, Tund received a message from his board threatening to remove him for misusing company influence. He stared at it and said, "Change always demands cost." Across the street, the landlord prepared a new strategy. Amaka reviewed the foundation documents alone and understood that victory in public did not end private battles. She had gained trust, but powerful forces now watched closely. She asked herself with steady resolve, when corporate power and political pride unite against a fragile community effort, will unity remain strong enough to survive? The attack did not come with guns. It came with signatures. 3 days after the public confession, a court injunction arrived, ordering all construction to stop immediately. The document declared that the foundation violated municipal regulations and posed financial risk to the district. Amaka read it aloud before the gathered residents and said, "They now fight us with paper." Tund examined the seal and said, "This was filed by Councillor Bami." The landlord stepped forward, pretending innocence, and said, "The law must be respected." Amaka looked at him and replied, "The law must not be weaponized." The crowd murmured with anger, but waited for direction. Tund's lawyer advised, "We can challenge this in a higher court." Amaka asked, "How long will that take?" The lawyer answered, "Months, perhaps longer." A woman shouted, "Sickness will not wait for court dates." Sola stepped forward holding financial records and said, "Our accounts are transparent." Amaka nodded and said, "Publish everything online and on paper." Tund agreed and ordered copies distributed across the neighborhood. They refused to hide. That afternoon, journalists arrived after hearing rumors of scandal and political conflict. One reporter asked, "Amaka, are you exploiting sympathy to build influence?" She answered, "If transparency is exploitation, then we accept the charge." Another asked Tund, "Is this a publicity move?" Tund replied firmly, "I gain nothing by angering my board." The reporter pressed, "Then why persist?" he said. "Because she reminded me that wealth without responsibility is failure." The cameras recorded every word. Meanwhile, Councillor Bamidel held his own press conference, claiming the foundation threatened regulatory stability. He said, "Unstructured charity invites corruption." The landlord stood beside him, nodding. Their message spread quickly through radio and social media. That evening, Amaka called a meeting and said, "They paint us as reckless." A teacher replied, "Then show discipline." Sola added, "We will invite independent auditors." Tunda confirmed, "My firm will not control the audit." Kioma asked quietly, "What if they freeze the funds?" Tunda answered, "They cannot freeze personal donations." Amaka turned to the community and said, "Then we must contribute what we can." A mechanic declared, "I will give 1 day's income each week." A food vendor said, "I will feed construction workers free." Others followed with pledges, small but sincere. Amaka felt strength rise, not from wealth, but from participation. She said, "This is how community breathes." The next morning, inspectors arrived demanding access to documents and threatening penalties. Amaka handed them full records without hesitation. One inspector whispered, "You are unusually cooperative." She replied, "Because we have nothing to hide." Despite notice appeared sealing the clinic extension site. The tape stretched across unfinished walls, like a challenge. Tund clenched his fist and said, "They hope to frustrate us into surrender." Amaka answered, "Then frustration must meet patience." Days passed with no progress allowed on construction. Sick residents returned to overcrowded facilities. A child with severe asthma struggled for breath while waiting for treatment. His mother cried, "If the extension was open, he would be inside already." Amaka visited the boy at night and said, "Hold on." She left the clinic and confronted the officials directly at their office. She said to Councillor Bamidel, "Your injunction now costs lives." He responded calmly, "Procedures must be followed." She replied, "Procedure without compassion becomes cruelty." He answered, "Emotional arguments do not govern cities." Amaka leaned forward and said, "But votes do." His expression shifted. Meanwhile, Tun's corporate board voted to suspend him as acting CEO, pending review of his activities. The announcement spread quickly. Reporters asked him, "Will you withdraw from the foundation to save your position?" He answered, "No." One board member called privately and said, "This path will ruin your career." Tund replied, "Then perhaps my career needs He hung up, knowing the consequences were real. For the first time, he faced loss, not measured in money. Back in the neighborhood, whispers began again. Some residents said, "If he falls, we lose funding." Others feared political retaliation. The landlord exploited this fear, saying, "See what her stubbornness has brought?" Amaka gathered the community and spoke firmly. "If this foundation depends on one man's corporate seat, then it is weak." Sola said, "We can register independently." A retired civil servant offered to help navigate bureaucracy. They filed new paperwork under a revised structure fully compliant with municipal codes. Every signature was witnessed publicly. They invited civil society observers to monitor progress. Transparency became their shield. Councillor Bamidel received notice of the revised registration and grew uneasy. He had expected collapse, not adaptation. He called the landlord and said, "They are persistent." The landlord replied, "Then we attack reputation again." An anonymous blog post resurfaced details of Amaka's sacrifice with exaggerated lies. It portrayed her as manipulative and immoral. Students at her university began whispering when she walked past. Kioma confronted her and said, "This spreads beyond the street." Amaka answered, "Truth spreads slower than gossip." Tund offered to fund legal action against the blog. She said, "No, we will answer publicly." She accepted an invitation to speak at the university forum. Standing before lecturers and students, she said, "Yes, I made a painful choice to save a life." She continued, "Judge me if you must, but ask yourselves whether you would have done the same." The whole remained silent before applause began slowly and then grew louder. A professor stood and said, "Moral courage deserves defense." News outlets reported the speech, shifting public opinion. Facing growing scrutiny, Councillor Bamidel softened his stance and announced a review of the injunction. The tape sealing the construction site was quietly removed days later. Work resumed with renewed determination. Yet victory carried scars. Tund officially lost his CEO position but retained significant shares in the company. "I told Amaka I have lost title, but not purpose," she answered. "Purpose weighs heavier than title." As walls rose again and community members worked side by side, Amaka felt both pride and fatigue. Opposition had not vanished. It had only She knew power rarely concedes permanently. One evening, Sola approached her with concern and said, "Our funds are nearly exhausted." Tund added, "Without corporate backing, future phases may stall." The community stood at another threshold. Amaka looked at the half-finished building and asked the question now pressing harder than before. If sacrifice built the foundation and unity defended it, will endurance sustain it when resources run dry? The money finished faster than hope expected. Sola stood before the trustees and said, "Our balance can sustain 2 more weeks of construction." Amazon added, "Suppliers now demand advance payment." Amaka listened without interruption and then asked, "How much do we require to complete the emergency ward?" Sola replied, 10 million naira. Tund leaned back and said, "Without my former executive authority, corporate channels are closed." A trustee asked, "Can you sell shares?" He answered, "If I sell too many at once, the market will crash and weaken the company further." Silence pressed against the walls. The landlord seized the moment and spread word that the project was collapsing. Aside, openly dreams without deep pockets become nightmares. Some residents began to withdraw their small pledges. Fear returned like an old creditor. Amaka called an emergency assembly and said, "If we stop now, every insult spoken against us becomes truth." A trader replied, "Courage does not print money." She nodded and said, "Then we must find money without surrendering control." Eyes turned toward Tund. He said, "There are international grants for community health initiatives." Sola responded, "Applications take months." Amaka asked, "What if we combine grants, local bonds, and diaspora contributions?" The idea hung in the air. Kioma stepped forward and said, "Nigerians abroad send billions home yearly." Amaka faced the crowd and declared, "We will invite our sons and daughters overseas to invest in their own street." Tunda offered, "I can connect you to credible platforms." Within days, they launched an online campaign detailing every expense and every objective. Amaka recorded a direct message saying, "This project belongs to those who believe community must protect life." The video spread through social networks. Donations began small but steady. A nurse in Houston sent $50 with a note reading, "For my mother's street." A taxi driver in London contributed with the message, "I remember where I started." Hope rose again, but slowly. Meanwhile, Councillor Bamidele sensed the shifting narrative and attempted reconciliation. He visited publicly and said, "My concern was only regulatory compliance." Amaka replied before cameras, "Then join us openly." He hesitated but agreed to symbolic support. The landlord whispered to him afterward, "You surrender to Izali." Bamidele responded, "Public opinion now favors them." Power had adjusted its posture, but not its instincts. Despite new contributions, a gap remained. Sola reported, "We are still 4 million short." Tunda said quietly, "I can liquidate a portion of my personal art collection." Amaka shook her head and replied, "You have already lost your title. I will not let you lose stability." He answered firmly, "What is stability without integrity?" She met his eyes and said, "Shared burden is stronger than heroic rescue." The trustees approved a community bond plan, allowing residents to invest small amounts with modest return. Some doubted repayment capacity. Amaka stood before them and said, "If we fail to repay, we failed together." An elderly man approached with savings wrapped in cloth and said, "I invest not for profit but for dignity." His action moved others. Weeks passed with relentless effort. Construction resumed at full pace as funds gradually filled the gap. Children carried water for workers, and women cooked meals on rotation. Even those who once mocked began to assist quietly. Yet hardship sharpened tempers. One afternoon, a supplier accused Sola of delayed payment and threatened to withdraw materials. Sola defended himself angrily, and voices escalated. Amaka intervened, saying, "Quarrels feed our enemies." She arranged a transparent payment schedule and invited the supplier to review accounts personally. Seeing the openness, he relented and extended credit. Trust, though fragile, deepened. Tund faced his own trial when former colleagues mocked him publicly for sacrificing ambition. At a business conference, one said, "You traded a throne for a clinic." Tundra replied calmly, "A throne without conscience is a cage." The remark circulated widely. Back in the neighborhood, final roofing began. The emergency ward took shape in brick and cement. People touched the walls, as if confirming reality. On the eve of completion, vandals struck at night, breaking windows and scattering materials. The landlord denied involvement, but suspicion lingered. Amaka surveyed the damage and said, "Destruction will not tire us." Volunteers arrived at dawn to repair what was broken. A teenager who once spread rumors now worked hardest. He told Amaka, "I was wrong." She answered, "Correction matters more than pride." Donations surged after news of the vandalism reached supporters abroad. The remaining deficit closed within days. Sola announced, with visible relief, "We have reached full funding." The opening ceremony approached, but tension remained. Amaka worried that celebration might weaken vigilance. She told Tunde, "Success attracts new forms of interference." He replied, "Then governance must remain firm." On the day before inauguration, inspectors returned unexpectedly, claiming final compliance checks. Some feared another delay. After hours of scrutiny, the lead inspector said, "All standards are met." Applause erupted across the compound. That evening, as lights were installed inside the new ward, Amaka stood with Kioma and whispered, "We came close to collapse." Amaka replied, "We did not bend." Yet as she prepared her speech for the inauguration, she faced a deeper question. The clinic would open, lives would be saved, and unity had proven powerful. But would the spirit of shared responsibility endure once urgency faded? Residents filled the street, not with noise alone, but with expectation. The new emergency ward stood ready behind them. The crowd answered, "We open responsibility." A journalist asked him quietly, "Do you regret losing your position?" The question ended there. Some clapped politely, others remained silent. Amaka watched him and then addressed the crowd directly. She said, "Partnership without accountability is deception." The words landed heavily. She continued, "This ward exists because people refuse to surrender when opposed." Heads nodded in agreement. An elderly woman stepped forward uninvited and said, "My grandson will live because of this place." Tears moved through the crowd, not as weakness, but as proof. Tunda bowed his head slightly. The ribbon was cut without Patients were admitted within the first hour. A pregnant woman in distress became the first emergency case. After tense minutes, the doctor emerged and said, "Mother and child are stable." Applause erupted again, louder than before. The ward had justified its existence on its first day. The landlord approached Amaka and said quietly, "You have won admiration, but power always demands loyalty." She answered, "Power belongs to the people now." He walked away, dissatisfied. Later that afternoon, a delegation from Tun's former company arrived unexpectedly. Their spokesperson said, "The board recognizes positive public impact and invites you to return as advisor." Tund looked at Amaka before replying. Amaka spoke first. "If your return requires distance from this community, then the offer tests your priorities." Tund faced the delegation and said, "I will advise only if community investment becomes official corporate policy." The spokesperson hesitated and replied, "That is a large structural change." Negotiations paused. The delegation requested private discussion. After hours, they returned with conditional agreement to create a community investment division under corporate governance. She accepted without pride. Financial reports were posted publicly. Victims began arriving at Amaka's ward beyond capacity. Doctors warned, "We cannot treat everyone without exhausting supplies." Sola added, "Our reserves will deplete." Others insisted, "Life does not recognize district boundaries." The debate grew heated. Amaka called an emergency vote. She said, "If we limit compassion to contributors, we betray our founding principle." The room waited for decision. Amaka stood and declared, "We expand services temporarily and request regional collaboration." The vote was taken openly. Majority supported expansion. Supplies was stretched, but managed carefully. Other communities began sending assistance rather than criticism. What began as local effort grew into regional network. The landlord remained quiet, sensing diminished influence. One evening, as the outbreak subsided, Tund approached Amaka outside the ward. He said, "You could have chosen personal comfort long ago." Understood. Kioma joined them and said, "You both changed more than a street." Amaka responded, "The street changed itself when it chose courage." Months later, the foundation expanded training programs and scholarships. She replied firmly, "Community is not automatic. It is chosen daily." The landlord eventually sold his properties and moved away. His influence faded. Councillor Bamida adjusted policies to encourage participatory budgeting. Even skeptics acknowledged transformation. On the anniversary of the ward's opening, Amaka addressed the residents once more. She continued, "Sacrifice must be followed by structure, unity, and vigilance." Sola presented audited statements, showing surplus reinvested into preventive care. As the gathering ended, Amaka looked across faces once divided by fear. She understood that her private pain had become public strength. The answer rose not in words but in the steady continuation of shared work.